It's only a minute or so to clip. But it's that Chris Jones, who was studying herself as a senior manager who was looking at inclusion. And this is Chris just talking about that experience that decided that she would become a teacher. Okay? And as I say, it's less than 2 minutes, but I just want to, first of all, show you, so you can just listen to what she says. And then I want to introduce the importance of the visual for communicating the meanings of our, what I call, embodied values. So as you watch, if you would not just listen to what Chris, but feel the way she is expressing herself with meanings coming through her body. And then I want to just focus on the visual as a medium for communicating really important messages. But this is just Chris talking about that experience, that the same guy was asking you if you would just talk to each other about something that really mattered to you in relation to your history.
That really stands out in my mind, and it's always been with me, is the time that I decided when I wanted to be a teacher. I remember it, and it's always been with me. And I was in reception class, and I used to have this habit of sort of sitting on the chair, and there's a wall behind me, and just, up and down and fidgeting, and just unaware really of what I was doing. But much to my horror, which I hadn't realised, was that what I was doing, when I was banging against this chair, there was a display right around the room of nursery rhymes and so on, and what I was doing was damaging this display because the chair kept on knocking it, but I was completely unaware of this. And the first time I became aware of it is when the teacher stood up in class and started shouting at me, telling everybody what a terrible girl I was for causing all this damage after she'd spent so much time putting up these nursery. And I was mortified because I didn't realise, and I thought that's all she needed to have said was to have come over to me and say, Christine, do you realise it? Would you? And even then I would be mortified at the thought of having done this. And I decided then that I was going to be a teacher, and I was going to do it the right way. There was this sense of unfair. Yeah, I know, I remember thinking that. I was 4 years old, something like that, and that's always been with me. And when I'm thinking of connecting that to my experiences this week, I did certainly feel no connection with her at the time, but it could have been done in a way whereby I may have valued, oh gosh, thank you for telling me, I didn't realise that. Was there anything I can do to help prepare it? Or there could have been a connection there, but I just felt the way it was done, there was.
Okay. Very powerful experience. At the age of 4, a teacher influenced Chris Jones by the way she spoke, the shouting in the class, and Chris said, I was mortified. Now that word mortified relates to feeling humiliated, feeling distressed. And then Chris just talks about the way it could have been done much better. She could have spoken gently to Chris, and even then Chris said she would have been mortified, but not humiliated in front of the whole class. Now it's these experiences, which I think most of you will have had some kind of experience, which, if you like, mattered to you, which has helped to understand why you are a teacher, what it is, for example, when you want to develop the learner-focused work in the classroom. Okay, well, what is it that has moved you to do this? And it often comes out of your own personal lives and your personal experience. That's why we don't, in Living Theory, shy away from talking about what really mattered to us in terms of our personal history, because it's only through those that we understand why we are doing what we are doing. And there is Chris, and now in her 40s, still influenced by that experience and passionate about what she's doing to bring inclusion and the student voice into the classroom. Now, the thing that I want you to focus on, if you would, is something that I became aware of when I was given one of the first video cameras in London in a science department, and I was just asked to explore its potential for learning. That was in 1971-72. First thing I did was turn it on myself, and I think I mentioned that I thought I got inquiry learning going. The videotape showed clearly that I hadn't. So that was my very first use of the video. As I kept using the video, in the 1980s and 1990s, I became increasingly aware of how the visual data communicated meanings of what we call the embodied expression of values that could not be communicated through the kind of words on pages of text. So most of my early publications were like this. They were like the ones that you published in the Science Journal. All words. And then, in the 1990s, I began to see that by including the visual, the video, I could communicate new meanings of the values of educators that could not be put in printed text. And this has helped to transform the nature of the meanings that can come into educational research. I'll just show you what I mean with this clip from Christine. What I was really pleased with was when, around 2000, the videos changed from being the tapes, quite large equipment, to digital, which meant that the digital process of the technology enabled me to do this. Okay? Now, you can go through, in seconds, a whole hour of your video. What you could do with this digital technology is to pause where you feel there are moments, and you can just see how animated Chris is, can't you? This really mattered to her. She's talking. Just look at the expression. That sense of the feeling mortified. And here she's talking, and she's obviously overcome the tension because she's able to communicate, as she's speaking with us, some of the pleasure in the dialogue together. But most of the expression is one of, you see here the tension, how she's reliving that moment of being mortified with that teacher, and then actually doing it better. As you move your cursor backwards and forwards, you can actually see very different expressions of meanings to the ones that you can get within the text. Now that can be done in seconds, and what I want to focus on is this, that the text that all of you will be writing, or some of you, I check, will be publishing, cannot carry in its meaning the kind of energy that I'm expressing in the here and now. That the meanings that, for example, I'm feeling, first of all, is one of pleasure. I actually enjoy being in workshops, being with committed educators, and I actually feel a flow of what I call life-affirming energy. Now, I hope that you can sense some of that energy as I speak. I'm pleased when you come up with the responses to me. I was delighted when I saw your papers last night and read through, the abstract. When you talked about the learner-centered ICT, I could connect it with the two colleagues and friends at Dublin City University, and that again evokes that energy of the pleasure that comes into my educational relationships. The video will help me to communicate the meaning of that energy with those values. Because I'm hoping that you also experience my desire for your voices to come to the fore. if I don't hear your voices and work with them, I'm not really in the educational context I believe in. But partly that is my relationship with you at this moment. Without the visual data, I would not be able to communicate, and neither will you, I'm suggesting, the energy which is life-affirming, the values that are passionately held by you in what you do in education. That's why this medium, and I will show you one or two other clips later, to communicate some of the what we call energy-flowing values that cannot come into the traditional text. This is so important because of the research dissertations, like a master's or a doctoral degree. I realized in the early 2000s that the doctoral degrees that I was actually supervising at the University of Bath had to conform to the regulations which did not permit the submission of e-media and the digital form. They all had to be in written text. I complained about this for some time because I was on what was called the University Senate. I was a senator. And it got to the point where in 2003, the Senate set up a special committee of some of its members to look at the university regulations governing the submission of research degrees. Now, it surprised me how simple it was for that committee to put forward a recommendation which simply said that e-media would be permitted within a research degree. That recommendation went to Senate. There was hardly any debate, and the previous years there had been furious debates about whether this could happen. But in 2004, it just went through. The recommendation was accepted, the regulations were changed. One of my students was the first one in 2004 to put forward e-media. She was a lecturer at Middlesex University. She'd studied herself as being a tutor. She integrated video clips of her tutoring of students within her thesis. And that was the very first one to be accepted at the university with multimedia. Now that was in 2004, and since then there have been numerous doctoral theses and also masters you accepted. That was the very first one at Bath Spa University, which went through 2 years ago by Christine Jones. And literally all over the country now, and also in some universities abroad, they are accepting the visual narrative through e-media because it communicates these energy-flowing values. Now, I'll come back to this because in the afternoon session, I want to focus increasingly on your stories as you began to talk with each other. And then I want this afternoon to start to bring these stories as educational researchers that can be actually made into rigorous forms of narrative, but grounded in your anecdotes about what is important. So we don't lose the connection with what you believe to be important in your stories. I hope I'm making sense here, because until that first degree in 2004 as a doctorate, all the ones before that, the doctoral researchers lost contact with their embodied expressions of value because the form of representation that the university required did not permit that form of representation, where the embodied values, the connection with what the individual did in practice, could be brought into their thesis. So there was a separation. There was a big gap. Whereas what I want to try and show you is how you can build up your narrative, your story, grounded in who you are and what you are doing, in a way that keeps that connection with what you do in practice with your students, and at the same time can be seen to be rigorous academic research that can be legitimated at the highest level. Could I just check with you that I'm being clear about this, because you can imagine that in terms of living theory, this is a really important transformation, and that at the University of Bath took place, as I say, in 2004. Last week, I sent back a report on a doctorate, really nice piece of work from Stellenbosch University. And I was asking that this should be put on the web. And it's all about science education. It's a PhD I think we'll all enjoy. And it actually linked in with what we were saying about ICT, because it was using ICT within the science education. And yet, the form was simply written text. And what I was actually saying in my report was that perhaps the regulations might change at that university to permit the visual narratives to be expressed. Are you okay with this? Because you might find within your own universities that to develop living theories with the new technology, you will need to bring in regulations that allow this form of representation. Because so many universities, there's even in the UK, I was examining one in the north of England, this was 6 months ago, and it was the same thing. In the Viva, I asked the individual why he hadn't used the new technology and the visual medium when a lot of the work that he was doing was referring to it. And he explained that the university regulations did not permit him to submit this kind of medium. So, if you remember when I talked about you influencing the social formations, this might be something you need to take on as an influence if your universities are not permitting this form of representation. You can make this part of your action research, as I did with Mark. I actually integrated this Senate committee within my own action research, explained how I'd influenced the recommendation, and how then my student was one of the first actually to put in a multimedia account. And that was part of my influencing the social formation in which I live and work. Now, can I just pause there, because I've introduced this idea that the multimedia is really important to living theory. I've tried to demonstrate through my body, in the here and now, that the energy which I'm feeling about what I do, and I hope you feel this kind of passion, a real belief that educators like yourselves could be making a very significant contribution to educational knowledge by making public what it is you do with your students and explaining that. It is a passion of mine, and I hope that you feel the energy and the values that are behind it. And they can't be captured in the pages of text. You would need to see, I think, the visual data, and I'll put some of this on YouTube, so that if you wish, you can just access 3 or 4 minutes of my demonstration of this energy with these values that I'm saying I think you might need to bring into your own account. Now, is there anything before we just break for lunch that you feel that you'd like to take up with me, just in terms of what I've been saying now? Yes?
Thinking about assessing student learning after we teach them for a lesson, how can we improve the visuals, developing their own learning theory? So, yeah, now that was a lovely lunch. I hope you're refreshed. Yes. Yeah, really good. I've also got much to download that video, so I'll show that in a minute. And as I've done usually, and I've said, look, I will pause each time just to see if there's anything that you were talking about together that you feel you'd like me to clarify or to develop as an idea, so I'll do that now. Just to say, look, are there any issues that you want to raise or development of ideas you want me to take forward? Just say, and I'll bring them into this afternoon's session. Is there anything? And as I say, if it occurs to you at any point, don't hesitate just to come up to the microphone and actually say what it is that you're feeling you'd like to bring to the group. Because I would like people just to be sitting there feeling either confused or
there's something you want me to develop further. And if you're sitting there just feeling a little confused or it's not clear, as I say, the tendency is for you just to sit there and say nothing, where I'd really like it if you came to the microphone and just said, you know, I'm feeling a little confused about this, and you'd like me to explain it further. Because the question that I was asked before lunch, it was a very important question, and it was to do with this idea of how do you integrate this kind of data into your research report as part of the assessment of your influence. And what I did before lunch is to download a video clip from one of the teachers, Joy Mountain, who brought this kind of evidence into her research report to evaluate her influence with her pupils. And if you remember, these are 6-year-olds, and they're showing in the video that they really do understand the action-reflection cycle. And Joy's claim was that she'd actually influenced their creativity in responding to the action-research cycle. Now, I put on the board, on the screen, what is called the task wheel. This was developed by Belle Wallace, who was president of one of our associations that focus on able and gifted children. Belle developed this, working some 19 years in. It was actually in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. She comes part-time over to England. And this is known as the task wheel, which means thinking actively in a social context. And you'll see that it has the characteristics of an action-reflection cycle, in that she wants to know what you know about something. What's the task? In other words, going through the action-reflection cycle, what do you want to improve? How many ideas can I think of? That is where you are developing your possibilities to improve. Which is the best idea? You create that in your action plan. So you decide that that's what you're going to do. And then let's do it. The question, how well did I do, is that question of evaluation. You need to gather data to make a judgment. Then this idea, let's tell someone, is vital for research that you share your research report. That's partially what makes it research. Research is systematic inquiry that you make public. It must be made public so that other people can actually judge the validity of your account. And I find, well, what have I learned? Which is linked to that explanation that you give for your influence in learning. And this is known as the task wheel. And this is being used in a lot of our classrooms, primary and secondary, to help the pupils improve their learning. Now, I'll just show you where you can access part of this. If you look at page, it is 2-4. 2-4 in your booklet. You'll see that there's one diagram there, and then on 2-6, 2-6, you have the diagram of the task wheel is thinking actively in a social context. If you just turn the pages over to 2.11, you come to Appendix 1, which is the action planner that I've been encouraging you to use so that you can actually carry out an action research program yourself. The importance of doing that is that learning from a book is one thing. You think you know by reading from a book. The difference between doing something, like actually doing the action reflection cycle yourself, and trying to learn to do it from a book is very, very different. It's like writing a research report in text, and the difference between showing what it is you do with the multimedia, with the energy and the values, you've got to live it and experience it to know it. So what I'm going to show you now is how the 6-year-olds related to this action reflection cycle of the task wheel, and the teacher, Joy Mountain, integrated this within her research report as part of her assessment of her influence with her pupils. Now, I want to show you where you can access this report, and I hope you all will, at some point, just have a look at it. Now, the way you can actually access it, I showed you the other day, is you go into actionresearch.net, which is our basic entrance to all these resources. You go into the Master Educator's Writings, and if you go towards the bottom of this group of writings, you come to the units which deal with the idea of understanding, learning and learners. This was a master's unit at the University of Bath, and Joy Mounter's assignment was this one here, which is, can children, go up again, it's this one, can children carry out action research about learning, creating their own learning theory? So this is where Joy produced an account which explained her influence with her 6-year-olds. And again, if you click on that, it comes up and you can access it and have a look at this writing of Joy's, can children carry out the action research about learning, creating their own learning theory? You'll see that Joy starts with her values. It's simple, I love teaching. I'm still excited by the possibility in the children I teach. Their thinking, their way of thinking and expressing themselves. I'm writing this as a teacher researcher who wants to contribute to educational knowledge. Joy involved her 6-year-olds in this inquiry, and I'll just show you here the kind of diagram 6-year-olds produced. Here is the task, the representation of the task group going round. But what the pupils were saying is that the 2-dimensional model, which was flat on the table, I'll show you like this, was not appropriate to explain their learning. They needed a 3-dimensional model, and they were giving these attachments to it to show this idea of something developing over time. Something was coming out of the wheel over time. And I'll now show you the video, which actually you can access 3 of them, and the appendix, where the children are actually working with Joy to redevelop this task wheel into something 3-dimensional and dynamic. Now, this, for the examiners, placed it beyond reasonable doubt that Joy had really influenced the pupils' creativity in the way that she claimed. I'm not going to play all of this clip to you because it lasts some 5 minutes. But like with the cursor I showed you before, if you'll just watch the animation of these 6-year-olds as they're participating in the conversation. Now this boy here is the boy that's actually trying to explain that the 2-dimensional model is not adequate to explain his own learning. I'm not sure if you'll manage to get the sound and hear the sound, because sometimes in English on the video it is not very clear. But I'll just play you just a little bit of it so you get a sense of how to integrate this kind of data into your account if you want to show your influence with your students.
Ideas that I hadn't even thought of. So what would be in the middle here?
Like a little room.
You think
where
we should...
your learning will go through.
Yes. Ah, so when it comes underneath. So it would almost be like a sort of a cushion, wouldn't it? Almost. So as you're thinking, you can't fall off the edge, it would sort of curve underneath, come up through.
But it wouldn't be a wheel then.
It wouldn't look like a wheel. Perhaps you get it bigger than a name. What would you call it then, do you think?
A hemisphere. Yes, a hemisphere.
Do you think it would be quite interesting if we could make one, wouldn't it? I'd love to see
Yes.
your ideas. What sort of colours do you think you would choose?
I think probably red, a dark red, and then light out. Yeah, I think you choose bronze.
Danny, you were saying having red and oranges and pinks, that's out together. Why would you have the yellow around the outside, do you think?
This could be like the bit where it's not as high as the bits in the middle. So this will like
this is the brilliant thinking.
yeah, this is this is like the dark red, which this is for like the hard fingers. And this is for like the middle fingers. So this would be like a.
But then we know it'll get outside, and this will be like a hard finger. So it gets lighter outside because you're thinking harder.
I hope you can sense the excitement of the 6-year-olds as they are bringing their own ideas into the conversation. And the teacher is really just encouraging their voices to be heard. Now this document contains 3 of these video clips of the children. And the examiners said it was beyond reasonable doubt that the teacher, Joy Mountain, had influenced the creativity of the students to build this different model of an action reflection cycle, which wasn't just this 2-dimensional wheel, which is on page 2.6 of your text. Now what the children, 6-year-olds, were showing is that it needed to be 3-dimensional and dynamic and moving in a way that the person who originated this, Bell Wallace, came to the school and agreed with the 6-year-olds that the model needed to communicate. It was actually 3-dimensional and it was dynamic to really capture their learning. Now, it's this kind of account which Joy Mountain took the children's, and these are the children's ideas, and she integrated these ideas within her account. The children came up with what they called a quiff model, which was questions we all have to ask in order to learn. The you we need to understand, which is making sense of things around us and ourselves. The I, and that's really important. And this was the children saying that the I needed to come in their inquiry. And therefore the feelings, these they said, were so important to them as learners. And you know yourself how difficult it is as academic researchers, given our backgrounds in sometimes positivist science, to bring feelings into our explanations, even though we know that they are really important. And F was focused to be able to concentrate and persevere. This was the language that the 6-year-olds were using. And you could hear the little girl not being too sure when she said hemisphere. And it's actually quite a complex idea for a 6-year-old to be using in relation to a model. But she was right, that it was more like a hemisphere, that actually then in 3-dimensional and it was dynamic. But what I'm trying to emphasize is the way in which we can integrate the ideas of our students within the explanations we give as evidence of our influence. Now, I hope that answers partially the question about how do you integrate this kind of data within the explanation that you would give of your influence. And I don't know how many of you are already using multimedia forms of representation in your universities. Could you just put your hands up if you are already using this kind of representation in terms of your research reports into your teaching, the influence of your teaching? No? Somebody? No? Nobody? Okay, my question then is, why not? Why not? Why do you think it is that, for example, I've been using this technology now for over 10 years, 10, 11, 12 years. Why is it that in relation to
the Thai research community here that you're not integrating this technology, which seems to me very exciting, both in classrooms and also for our own researchers, educational researchers as educators. Have you got any reasons why you think that at the moment this is not being integrated within your own explanations of influence? Anybody? Would anybody like just to say? Because this notion of constraint is very important. The idea that there are constraints sometimes with particular cultures. For example, in Africa, there was nowhere near the same quality of internet connection that you've actually provided here. I could not do what I'm doing with you today when I was working at Nelson Mandela University. I couldn't be at Cape Town University. It's only recently they've begun to make sure that their internet connections are anything like as good as this. You see, I could not, in Stellenbosch University, I could understand that they could not bring into their doctorates this kind of technology where you can show with the digital images and move the cursor along to show the energy with the values. You know, if you haven't got the bandwidth to do it, you can't do it. But it seems to me, certainly what I'm experiencing here, is that you really do have access to the technology. So I'm curious, if you feel there are some constraints or some issues around you using this technology, the ICT, not only within your teaching, but also within your research, to actually show your influence. So, yes?
Yeah, I include not immediately in my teaching, but not in my research. Because I'm afraid that the research community might not recognize this kind of evidence or data.
Yeah. So the constraint.
You see the only picture from people like this and sample of in our study.
Right.
Yeah. Like we show, because sometimes for the same study for the master PhD, some regulation about writing is the indication for
This, it is interesting to me because, if you like, as I said, I had these struggles in 2003 to 2004. But, I had a struggle to establish, with a group from Senate in the University of Bath, a change in regulation. And the anxiety as academics that you must feel with the new technology, with anything new really as an innovation, that it might not be accepted as valid or rigorous. And this is something from 1993 when we started the self-study group in the American Education Research Association. And quite a large number of us have been concerned to bring, first of all, self-study. You know, this idea that the individual I could be placed within a research account. That was quite a breakthrough. And then, from early 2000 onwards, how do we integrate this form of data which we know to be significant? Because you will know that embodied expression of values, the energy that you feel, is important for your research. I'll guarantee that your love for what you're doing is communicated to your students, and it will be only through some visual and dynamic and moving images that you will be able to explain how you're expressing those values. So this issue of anxiety that it won't be accepted, it feels to me is a constraint on your creativity. And it is this issue of, well, what might you do about it? Because you've got in this room people who will be using ICT in the classrooms, so you'll be enhancing the learning of the students with the ICT, but clearly nobody in the room has yet to bring a multimedia ICT narrative into the Thai research community in relation to legitimate knowledge. Now, until this happens, something very significant, I think, might be missing from the knowledge base of Thai educational research? Yes? Yeah.
I talked to my group about this issue. Why not? Why doesn't we use this representation to include in our research? Why don't we use video classroom observation to support our research? Because we concerned about the ethical issue when we present the picture of the children. We aware of the children's right, because sometimes children express some misconception of their own, and it may be to see some negative from the children. So we are not sure that we can use that picture or that video to include in our research.
Okay. And that has been a legitimate concern of educational researchers in the different parts of the world that I've visited. I was president of the British Educational Research Association in 1988, and that organisation has published a number of ethical guidelines. And in 2007 and 8, they were very concerned in BERA, that's the British Educational Research Association, that the ethical guidelines were appropriate for practitioner research, for self-study. I will show you tomorrow how to access the web page with the ethical guidelines that all of our students and my students, you'll see in their accounts, they acknowledge that they are fulfilling the criteria in the BERA ethical guidelines. Okay, so your question is really important, but it hasn't stopped this kind of research. But what it does is make sure that ethical permissions are given by, in this here, by definitely the parents, that was actually asked of the parents because of this idea of what we call informed consent. Informed consent is very important with the children who are not at the age to vote. So the parents need to sign a document to say it is okay for the researcher to use these images in their research. When the children get to about 14, and certainly with the 16, 17-year-olds, the students also give their written permission. And so nothing is actually published without those ethical permissions, and it is informed consent. But it really hasn't stopped the research. Are you okay with this? Because I think I might be able to show you where you can access a master's dissertation, self-study, carried out in Canada. And it was by this man called Jeff Gladwell. Okay, now I'll just see if I can show you where you can access it, because it's very relevant to what you were asking in terms of the ethical guidelines. Now, Jeff Gladwell wanted to research his own practice. And I'll just see if I can access it at the bottom of this group, because here it is. Now, this one is interesting. There. On the ethics of personal narrative. I'm not sure if you can read that in big enough. Subjective research. This one here. I'll just see if I can make it bigger for you. See. Here we are. Okay, so the ethics, the personal narrative, subjective research. Now the reason that this is interesting is that Jeff was a teacher, wanted to study his own practice. His university had what is known as an ethical review board. Okay? We call it the ERB board. This is in Canada. That committee sent back his research and said he couldn't do it on ethical grounds because pupils were involved in his research. Even though he had the parental approval to carry out the research. Now, in my terms, the Ethical Review Board were acting unethically. They were stopping him from carrying out research which everybody had agreed could be carried out. Now, what Jeff did in his dissertation was not to carry out the research into his classroom, it was to carry out the research into the unethical behaviour of the review board of the university. And they couldn't stop him doing that on the grounds of academic freedom. Now, when you put these in the public domain, it actually changes the view of the ethical review boards. Do you see that they no longer stop research being carried out that has got informed ethical consent? But your question here is so important. In 1991, my university was paid quite a bit of money for me to support action research at Kingston University. They had a research committee to look at the action research and other research proposals. A head teacher who wanted to study with me the action research put in her proposal, how do I improve my practice as a head teacher? The research committee sent back a rejection on the grounds that I was in the title. Okay? That I, the personal program, was in the title. Now, you know that if you're a positivist scientist, you're taught to take the I out. So this research board was made up of mainly engineers and scientists. So they thought they were behaving ethically in requiring the I to be taken out of an action research inquiry, which doesn't make sense. If you take your I out of your inquiry, how can you have your inquiry? Now, it took us some months before we managed to get permission for that research to be done. But it was because of the outside pressure that was brought to bear on that research committee of that university, showing that this kind of work had been carried out in many other universities, that changed their minds and they allowed it. But I raise these points to emphasize that you could come across these tensions if you actually want to take this kind of research forward. And that is in England. Even 2 years ago, there was a university in the north-east of England still asking for the I to be taken out of an action research account, even though many other universities are now taking it for granted that you can conduct these inquiries as long as you have informed consent and follow the ethical guidelines of someone like either the Psychological Association or the British Educational Research Association. But I raise this because you're likely to come up against these kinds of tensions, all of which have been overcome, but you could, like with Jeff, he couldn't carry out his research in the classroom, but he found a way through it and did a beautiful piece of work, but it wasn't what he originally wanted to do, which was his classroom research to improve his classroom practice. But it's a lovely illustration. If you access that, you'll see how you can respond to some of these difficulties and bring them into your action research. If you're suffering from constraints, you don't just accept those, you actually bring them into your inquiry, because they are influencing, as a constraint, what you can do. And you have I'm not sure what it is like in Thailand, but in 1988 in England, the law came into force to protect the academic freedom of people like myself. And the law says that as an academic, I am free to question received wisdom without threat to my employment. And it is a very important law protecting the academic freedom, literally, of academics to explore, to test ideas without the fear of losing their jobs. In other countries, academics are not so fortunate. If they question, it can be quite damaging. Yes? Sorry, you want to? Yeah. I'm not sure if this question checked.
I think one of our limitation
of not bringing ICT or integrating ICT in our research paper or article is we rarely have the, online journal. We have, when we disseminate or publish our paper, it's just only in a hard copy. I think this is one reason. And another reason is we are not familiar with describing or writing the paper in the narrative pattern. Because we are in positivism, I think we have to shift our idea into the integrativist or living theory or something like that, or qualitative research. So when we report our findings, we just see the outcome or output of the research. Just, okay, student misconception, student achievement. We focus on the, the statistic, how many. That's it. So we don't know what happened in the classroom. We do not report what was happened in the classroom. So that's why we do not be aware of putting or integrating some video in our, use it as evidence. And I forgot. That's it. Maybe I have another round.
Yes, okay. Come back. Yes. Because those constraints are ones, when I talked about the third element of a living theory, which was to do with the social formation in which you live and work, then that is a really important one, which is to do with the way you are recognized as academics for disseminating your ideas in the public forums. Now those public forums, namely the journals, at the moment in Thailand, will be mainly text-based, if not all text-based. So you already have a constraint that you're only going to be recognized for your academic work if you publish in what is seen to be high-status journals from Thailand. But none of those at the moment, from what you're saying, are recognized multimedia text that will take your video of your classroom practice and your explanation of your influence with your students in their learning. So that is something that I think you've probably all got in common. This is a constraint which you could all take on as something which, as a group, you could be influential, because some of these issues require you to act as a group. Some of these things you cannot do as individuals. One of the famous action researchers, he developed an idea of participatory action research in Colombia, and his colleague was in, I think it was Bangladesh. It was certainly one of the East Asian countries called Rabin Ram, and the Colombia was called Orlando Falls Border. And they developed participatory action research because the rural community all have the same problem, like you have, I think, the same problem about the journals. The rural community were being cheated by the power companies in relation to the cost of the energy. And it was corruption. These rural communities are all gathered together with that as the problem. And they worked in an action research way to overcome that corruption. And they actually then managed to get fair bills from the energy companies. And that was where everybody had the same problem. Now actually, I hope I've shown you how, from yesterday's written work, you've all got different issues within your classrooms. You know, it's a lovely range of important ideas and concrete things you want to improve, a massive range in this room. When it comes to saying, what are your constraints, you've all got the same problem. That the very academic journals that give you your high status, at the moment, are not multimedia journals, so you cannot put in this kind of representation, which allows you to show what it is you do. Now, I'll just mention just one quality that, again, you might find you've got in common. It's linked to one of my doctoral students. Again, I'll just show you how you can access Marian's living theory. Marian was quite influential
in policy terms with our last Labour government in relation to health issues related to mental health. And in the living theory section, you'll be able to access Marian's document, where she was working with what we call Alzheimer's patients and their carers. Now, I'm not sure if you use the same term as we would about Alzheimer's. Do you understand it? It's dementia. We say there is a mental health issue with often older people who actually start to lose their faculties. They start to find it difficult to make sense of their experiences. And families are often their carers. And it's a very big problem growing in the United Kingdom. But here is Marian's. So Marian talked about the inclusional and responsive practice. But what she did in encouraging people to work creatively and critically, and it was in this multi-agency healthcare setting, she actually drew on the work of the Brazilians called Paulo Freire and Augustus Boal. Augustus Boal had a book on, and it was about the theatre of the oppressed. Paulo Freire, very influential in South America and also within Europe, for his text called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And it is a wonderful text about what he called the banking concept of education, where most of us have suffered from this kind of training and schooling, where we're treated as an empty vessel and things are supposed to be just pushed into our minds. In terms of Freire, was claiming that we need to develop a much more creative approach, as many of you are doing here with their students. And Augustus Boal, where Marian trained in this particular method in relation to the theatre of the oppressed, uses theatre to communicate some of the things that are happening in our societies that need to be changed. But I want you to focus on what Marian brought into the university as a new standard of judgment. And it's here that through this research and the writing of this thesis, I now also understand that my ontological commitment, and ontological means who we are, our being, what we're passionately concerned about, and hers was a passion for compassion. So Marian, for the first time, using video of, and if I can do this tomorrow, I will download it as I did with the classroom one, from her doctoral thesis, to show you what convinced the examiners about the meaning of a passion for compassion. It comes out of a relationship between a carer and the person cared for. This was a married couple, been married for 50 years, and the carer was the husband. And I'll show you the movement in his wife as he was telling Marian what he was doing as a carer, which communicated a passion for compassion. Now, everybody in this room, I don't know if this is true, but in this text, I'll find it for you tomorrow, but you probably already know this. And this was in my room. And it is just the teaching of Burnet. Okay, now, this is the first country I've been into where there is a text, the teaching of Burnet. Rather like in quite a lot of the hotels in the UK, there will be a Bible, okay? So the Christian tradition is quite powerful, still quite powerful. And you would have that. Here, you have both, and I own the teaching of Burnet. Now this is what, in relation to Marian's passion for compassion, it just struck me in relation to this idea of being influenced by my spirit of loving compassion. So at the heart, it seems, of your Buddhist philosophy and spiritual life is this commitment to a loving compassion. Just as Marian has brought her passion for compassion into her academic life and into the University of Bath as an academic standard of judgment, so I think you might consider bringing some of your values, which I do feel you do share some values. This is why I was attracted by the way you worked within community. And it feels that you're likely to take these for granted at the moment, rather than seeing how significant they are in relation to a value like loving compassion, which no words on a page of text can really communicate the meaning of that embodied expression, the lived expression of a loving compassion. Am I making sense here? Because you've got something I think you also share as a collective, but you've got your unique inquiries which could help you to form your living theories. Looking at whether it is the lunar issues with the children, with their conception of science, where you're working on instructional material and you're actually trying to evaluate how effective your production of those instructional materials are to help the children's notion of science. So you've got that as your individual inquiry. You've got a lovely one at the back this morning about the ICT, which links in with what we were saying, that you use this in your classrooms with the teachers, you use it yourselves, but not one of you yet have managed to get this into your research account of what you're doing. And just think how strange that sounds a little to me, where you are using this in your classrooms, and yet it's not coming into your educational research to show what you're doing. And it's such a, as I hope I'm showing, such a powerful medium to communicate the nature of our educational research. So I just check if there's anything else at the moment, because you brought up some really fundamental issues. I thought that one about the ethics, I will find that for you tomorrow so you can access the ethical guidelines, so that hopefully won't be a constraint. That you can always go with informed consent, ensure a research committee that you've got the informed consent of the participants, so that they should have no reason to stop you carrying out this kind of inquiry. Now, could I check again? Because, as I say, it's from your own questions and concerns that a lot of really useful learning, I think, goes on. So can I, in developing this idea of narrative, because I think you're right, that you need to feel that